Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. The other week, not too long ago, I was in Austin with our mutual friend Andrew, who's sometimes here for the programs. And while I was visiting Austin, there was a point where I was just out in a sort of public area, but it was a sort of courtyard surrounded by like spiritual shops and yoga centers and bookstores. So it was a very charged kind of area to be a Buddhist monk. And as I sat there, people would just kind of come up and sit down. And one of the running themes, and it's been a running theme throughout American Buddhism, is they would ask me for book recommendations or talk recommendations. And I'm the worst person to ask, as those who have tried to do this know that, you know, I don't consume a lot of media, a lot of Dhamma talks or books. I read one and I'm happy for years at a time. And I'm not holding it up as a virtue. I'm just saying this is a peculiarity of my mind and my style, is that I actually like to work things out for myself and to come up with my own language for things. And in some ways, listening to other talks would be, you know, just carrying on with themes that had already been developed. Whereas if I'm able to investigate a theme in a new way, it might benefit the whole, you know, by starting to talk and think that way. And this is something that, you know, just a few people do this and the whole group benefits. And so there are a few of us outliers who kind of are off on their own thinking weird and unique thoughts. And some of them are useful for explaining Dhamma in a new and insightful way. And some of it is just us being zany outliers. But as it turns out, there is one Dhamma talk, and I've been exposed to hundreds of Dhamma talks, but there's one Dhamma talk that really made a huge impact in my practice. And I've shared it around to other people, and they're like, okay, yeah, that was a good talk, or it was a kind of funny talk. And it didn't have the same effect on them. But this one talk has stood out time after time, because when I go back and I look at it, I realize it wasn't simply about the ideas presented, but what really made an impact was the person and the place and the time that talk was received. So I thought it's a kind of funny scenario, but I was reminded of this talk when people were asking me to recommend a Dhamma talk. And I said, well, there's one that floats to mind. And, you know, I've heard a bunch, but there's only one that was so memorable, I've come back to it again and again. And for those who are interested, the talk itself and a transcription of it, I'll put up on upovana.org, you know, probably following the talk. But to be no excitement, this will be a talk about a talk, as weird as that is, because I think the idea and the principle itself is interesting and insightful, because it deals with something that some people might not have much exposure to, and it's the idea of training. So when I think about Dhamma talks, you know, I think there's a difference between learning and training. And I knew instantly when I started to approach the Dhamma is that some learning was useful, but I really didn't need a lot of learning. Like I absorb the Dhamma themes and concepts and even the specifics of the Pali Canon very quickly, very easily. But what I really needed, what I really thirsted for was training. You know, what do I do? How do I do it? You know, train me, teach me, you know, how do I do this Dhamma? And that's part of the reason I ended up at a monastery. It's part of the reason I ended up becoming a monastic. And so this talk spoke to me as a young monastic looking for training. And it's an interesting thing. It's like I went to the monastery thinking of training in much the way you might see in a martial arts movie. And maybe that's how you all conceive of like monastic life, is you're going and you've got the teacher and he's like, do this, do that, punch like this, kick like this, yeah. And you become a master through apprenticeship. Well, you get to a Theravada monastery, and what you find is a bunch of monks who are very friendly and approachable, but who are really not putting a lot of effort into training you. And sometimes there isn't even a training regimen. You're like, yeah, you know, what's the meditation technique you teach? And I'm like, oh, whatever works. And you're like, what? I want instruction. And they're like, yeah, sit and let your mind go calm. And you're like, that's not instruction. If I could do that, I wouldn't have come to the monastery. Like I need training. And so I thought I was going to get this sort of martial arts experience with, you know, hours of the day and these special little exercises. And I got there and there was a bunch of people being very equanimous about my presence there, which is good for them. But I mean, I'm like, well, what am I supposed to do with that? But this is an interesting thing about training, because in martial arts, there's an objective goal. Yeah, you can punch better. You can punch better. And if you survive a fight, then it was a successful training. Yeah. But in Dhamma practice, it's sort of the other way around. The successful Dhamma practice is seeing all of the opportunities where you don't need to get in the fight in the first place. And how do you train that? You know, it's this sort of spiritual judo where you redirect energies or you absorb a blow without taking any damage. And it's not an easy thing to train. And in some ways, the training environment is one of, hey, you're going to have these senior monastics who have been doing this for many years, and you're going to be able to live near them. And so it's on you. There's going to be no training. They're not going to tell you what to do or when to do it. You've got to study them. You've got to analyze them. You've got to listen to the way they talk, and they'll give these instructional talks. But you've got to be able to figure out what's useful in there. You've got to be able to pull it apart and say, wait, that's something I can do. That's not just an idea. That's not just learning. That's training. I can do that again and again and again, and I can use that as leverage against all the crazy stuff that's going on in my mind. And when I showed up at the monastery, there was a lot of crazy stuff going on in my mind. So I needed things to do. I needed trainings. And so I was primed. I was ready. And, you know, I was looking, I was studying how the monks did stuff, and I was listening. And that was the environment where this particular talk was given a few months after I arrived. And it was given by another delightful outlier of the Theravada tradition, a monk named Ajahn Sona, who lives up in Vancouver, British Columbia. And he was visiting the monastery I was at in California. And he had just reached 20 years as a monastic. So he was giving a talk and kind of reflecting on 20 years. And he gave this talk that was in response to, we had just chanted the Dhammacakka Sutta. So the Dhammacakka Pavattana Sutta is said to be the Buddha's first formal teaching to a group of monastic-like individuals, former people he had been training with. And he gave this talk and he explained the Four Noble Truths. And specifically, he talked about the middle way. So Ajahn Sona was reflecting on the middle way, and it led him into a little anecdote about winter camping. And that was the framework of his talk, as he told this funny story about his learning the middle way through investigating how to camp in the Ontario winter at 40 below zero, which is actually the point where Celsius and Fahrenheit match. But if you imagine, like, not just survival, but actually going out into the wilderness and camping in that, and then trying to get something out of it. So he tells this story, and he sort of teases out these various principles. And my mind was so ripe that I seized on these principles, and I didn't even realize it. It was like planting some seeds in fresh soil. I didn't hear that talk or think about that talk again for 5 years. And it was when another monk recommended it to me that I went back and listened to the talk. And I'm like, oh, that's great. This is amazing. And then at the end of the talk, when the monks are chanting their sadhus, I heard my own voice calling, the calling for the sadhus, because I was the junior most monastic in the group at that talk. And I'm like, I was there. And then I started to see that sometimes we are exposed to an idea, and this is how training works in Buddhism, is this is path, as we talk about magga, is that you're given a principle, and it's not simply an idea or a piece of knowledge that you just file somewhere. It's a tool, it's a mental way of relating to reality that you begin to put into use. And through that, you discover the Dhamma, you discover the middle way. And so this was the first principle that I got from this talk, was the middle way was to be discovered. And Ajahn Sona's talk, if you could give it a name other than winter camping, it would be how to be a deluded Buddhist, because that's what I was. I was a Buddhist with delusion. And his talk was like, how do you get onto the middle way if you're deluded? It's possible. And I thought that just blew my mind. It was amazing, is that I could be a mess, but I could still practice. I could find the middle way by knowing that I was a mess and planning for it. And that was the middle way. And Ajahn Sona reflected on the Dhammacakka Sutta, which comes after the Buddha had gone in the wrong direction for 7 years of fierce self-mortification, and how he had let go of that and sort of discovered what it's like to find balance. And Ajahn Sona had gone into the Ontario wilderness and had packed everything because he had read up on winter camping. But the first principle of finding the middle way is that nothing beats experience. So first off, he went into the wilderness. He didn't train incessantly in a safe environment to the point that he was a master of camping before he went out camping. No, he went out camping trusting he would learn while camping. So he knew he wasn't good at it, but he decided to go anyway. And so experience is the best teacher. And this is a principle as anybody who knows me knows that this is Pamutto. It's like Pamutto is a kind of whack job who will be like, okay, so there's nobody, wandering on Dhutanga practice. Maybe I'll just do it. And people will ask him how, and he'd be like, I don't know yet. I've got to do it. Then I'll tell you. It's like, but isn't that an interesting thing? It's like we're presented with these trainings in Buddhism, like to not eat after noon while you're staying at the monastery, or to not watch TV. And you're like, how would I do that? This is an important part of my life. Dinner is like a third, and is the best third of the meals of the day. And like TV, I get so much information out of TV and so much entertainment. What would I do with that time? Well, you don't know unless you try, right? Do you get yourself in a situation where the TV's not on and you experience what that's like? And you're like, well, okay, my mind was telling me I was going to die, but it's not what I'm used to, but I'm not dying from not eating dinner. I'm not dying from not watching TV. I'm just burning up a little from craving. But the craving's not going to go anywhere if I don't challenge it. Experience being the best teacher, Ajahn Sona, in this talk, he goes out and he finds that all the stuff he had brought was essentially useless because he had planned for the trip in a warm, cozy apartment in Toronto. And then he gets out in the wilderness and it's nothing like the environment where he was doing the planning. And so he goes back and he talks with his friends who had gone out with him, and they study, like, how did this happen? And they realize they've got to learn a lot about camping, and very quickly, but that when they're back home, they can't trust the planning that they're doing. They've got to be planning for their camping trips while they're camping. Because that's where it's really real. That's where experience is there to teach them. And so I didn't plan for being a monastic for years and years and years, and then go be a monastic. It's like, oh, there's a monastery there. I think I'm going to try to practice. And I show up and it's like, okay, it's on. That's all they do here is practice Dhamma. But so Ajahn Sona and his friends, they decided what they would do is when they were out camping, they would take a notebook and they would write ideas down in the notebook. And then when they got back to their warm, safe, cozy apartments where they were well fed and could bathe and all of these things, where things work, because a lot of things don't work at -40, like pens don't write, and propane is a liquid. It doesn't burn, and all sorts of things. But when you're back in your home environment, they would open up the book and it would tell them what to do. And they'd be like, well, that doesn't sound right. We need, need to tie the head on the hatchet, or we need to do this, or we need to do that. But they'd be like, trust the book. Yeah. Because the book was written in the environment. Yeah, these were ideas that came about while we were training, while we were practicing with this. And so this is something that it was a seed that got planted in my mind. Yeah. So imagine a young monastic sitting there going, I'm kind of stupid. And a lot of the time, I can't trust what my mind is telling me to do. What if I could see those moments when I could trust my mind? Because I was in the environment and I was experiencing things and it was real and it made sense. What if at those times I made notes for myself? And then in those other times when I knew I was in a warm, cozy environment and my mind was filled with craving, I would open the book, or I'd open the notes and I would read what it said and I would just follow it. In some ways, in the absence of a more formal training, I was like, what if my better self could be my trainer, could be my teacher? It's like the stuff I find out works, I'm going to teach myself later through notes or through a principle. And this is something that's an ancient Buddhist tradition, actually. Monks would not necessarily live right next to the Buddha to be getting wonderful Dhamma talks and wonderful examples all of the time. A lot of times they would recognize they needed to go off and practice for themselves. And so they would ask the Buddha for a short teaching that they could memorize and take with them. And then when they got out into the woods and their mind was filled with, what about this? What about this? And, oh, I'm seeing bright lights, or I'm hearing sounds. Maybe that's it. They would think of the teaching that they had been given and that they had memorized, and they would use that as their compass of sorts. It would help get them back on the right heading. And so one of the important principles that I figured out very early on was a principle I've given a talk about before, that if your practice is developing and you have access to the basics of life, like food, shelter, medicine, and clothing, then you should stay put. Yeah, because what's more important than practice? Well, it's just survival. But if you're both practicing and surviving and it's working, you should stay put. But if at any time where the practice is not working, then you should consider leaving. And if at any time it's hard to live and you're not able to practice, you should leave immediately. Now, this is relevant even for lay people. As I've often told people, there's absolutely no reason. Life is short. There's absolutely no reason you should do something out of a sense of responsibility, or because it seems like the right idea. There's no excuse to be miserable. Yeah, there's no excuse to go backwards, even if it's profitable. Even if you're saying, well, in the future I can retire and then I'll practice. There's no such thing. You're not guaranteed a future. But for a monastic who's already living in the present moment, I would wake up every morning and be like, that person is annoying me, and this practice is stupid, and I'm so tired of getting up early, and I'm so hungry. I'm having dreams about buffet lines, and I wake up just before the first spoonful hits my mouth. And it's like, I've got to leave. I've got to go. I'll find a better training somewhere. But then I would look in my notebook and it would say, if your practice is developing and you're getting the basics of life, don't leave. And I'd be like, argh! And that's what it was like to be training and to be my own sort of mentor, as I had found a principle in the practice. And I had memorized it, and I used it as my compass. Yeah. Another interesting principle that Ajahn Sona hit on in this talk is the idea that some problems can't be solved. And it's a really interesting anecdote. Is his way of discovering the middle way in camping was to realize that through his method of training, that is with a notebook and letting experience be his teacher, but really learning from experience, he very quickly started to become successful and skilled in camping, to the point where he was shedding all sorts of extra weight. And then he ends up in a situation that is, a disaster, almost to equal his first camping trip, where he had tried to bring everything, where he brought nothing. He was just wearing boots and a raincoat and, had some bread in his pocket. And he slept through a snowstorm and woke up in the morning, and his feet are frozen, and he had to walk for, 40 kilometers to wake them up, and he realized that the goal of camping wasn't minimalism, because you can only go so far with minimalism, right? The absolute bottom line of minimalism is that you go out into the wilderness naked. You can't get any more minimalist than that. So there's a ceiling, there's a cutoff beyond which you can't develop. And he's like, well, minimalism isn't necessarily a virtue. Why was I going out camping in the first place? And he realized the reason he was trying to put himself in that environment was not to be able to go with the lightest load possible. It was the emotional load that he was trying to jettison. And so he veered a little bit away from minimalism and brought enough stuff that he could be comfortable. And he was like, oh, that's what this is about. This is not about being a master of having very few possessions, or being able to sit for super long times, or knowing all of the teachings, having memorized them and being able to call them up at a moment's notice. All of those things are perks, but it all comes down to, are you comfortable? Are you free from craving? Yeah. And so that involves actually bringing a few things with you. actually doing a little bit of planning, actually getting in the right scenario. So, isn't that, again, that was another seed that got planted in my mind. And I find that, all the monastics are, kind of experimenting with how little stuff they can have as a demonstration of their non-attachment. But actually, it took more non-attachment to own a few things and to take care of them. Because you recognize that it would conduce to more peace of mind. If you've only got one flashlight, to help you get to morning chanting, and you decide, oh, this flashlight, it weighs almost a pound. It's just dead weight. And you decide to give it up. Well, now you have no flashlight and you're kind of stumbling through the dark. It's like, yeah, you have fewer possessions that you need to take care of, but you're stumbling through the dark, falling down the hill. And you get up and you're all scratched up. And it's like, well, was that really wisdom? Yeah. What is the flashlight is the basic of, survival in certain situations. And so it's appropriate. It's a very good thing for a monastic to start to learn and explore. Yeah. And you maybe see this in your own lives, even if you're not a monastic, is there are, everybody's trying to live simple. But simple isn't necessarily having less stuff. Sometimes the simplest scenario is to have something. If you're biking, 3 hours to your place of work, and in sweating and in rain and with the bugs, the simpler thing might be to have a car, which, a car is quite a burden and it's expensive, but you look at it and it might actually be the simpler scenario, the one that frees up the most time and leads to the most comfort. So it's not to say that, we don't get fixated on a particular result. We analyze like what's working, and that is something it's going to change. Yeah. What's working is always changing. And so the problem of like, how do I take less stuff, or how do I own less stuff, is not actually a problem that can be solved. Yeah, because it has a cutoff. And so Ajahn Sona used this line. He said, this is not necessarily a problem that needs to be solved. It's a problem that needs to be dissolved. And years later, I used that line in a group of climate activists, and they like wrote it down, and they started spreading like wildfire through all of their climate activism groups, because they realized they were spending so much energy fighting, the powers that were working against them. And in some ways, they were creating their own conflicts. So that idea of dissolving a problem that's insurmountable really hit home with them. And likewise, there are some problems that we can't get past. Like, we need to eat, we need to sleep. Monastics are always experimenting with these things. How can I eat less? How can I sleep less? How can I, make do with, less clothing and all of these things? But is this a problem that really can be solved? No. You've got to eat something. And this is what the Buddha, used as his own insight into the middle way, because he tried starving himself, but that didn't work. But actually, when he fed himself a bit, it led to more comfort, and it was easier to meditate. So he found a happy medium, and in a way that was dissolving the problem of eating. So yeah, eating is a burden, but you step back from the problem just a little bit, and it ceases to become a problem. You're like, it's just part of life, actually. And how many of our problems are only problems because we insist that they're problems, and we insist we need to make this work. Whereas if we could just step back a little bit, we might be able to find a way where we can coexist with the circumstances as they are. And if we did that, they would cease to be a problem. So for the example of like climate activists, they realize that, somebody really wants to cut down this forest. And they're like, no, don't cut down any more trees. And so they create a problem. Whereas they're like, okay, well, we can't actually stop them from cutting down those trees. But what if we were to put in regulations to protect, the trees around them, and talk with the loggers to be sure that they're going to not damage the forest or to clean up after themselves? And it's like they realized by stepping back from the problem they were creating, there was a lot that they could do. And when they realized all of the things that they could do in this scenario without any conflict at all, it ceased to be a problem. Yeah, they had a way forward, a fruitful way forward that worked for both sides. And that's just one example, and we can probably think of many, in our lives. And so again, it's just these little seeds of wisdom. So this is training. The idea of, can we find a principle that we can apply? For me, this quirky, little talk, stroll down memory lane of Ajahn Sona learning about Buddhism through camping taught me a lot. And I took these principles and I worked with them for years. And there came a point in time where I went to my notebook and I said, is my practice developing? And I'm like, well, actually, no, it hasn't really gone anywhere for months now. I've got all of the requisites I can need. And in fact, through all the training I've done, I don't need much requisites at all. It doesn't take much food to make me happy. It doesn't take much, a very expensive shelter. In fact, I'm quite happy camping. And at that time, I realized I could safely leave the monastery. And this is probably one of the most important seeds that got planted, is this idea that I could be my own trainer eventually ripened into me being able to leave the training environment, because I could take the ability to train myself with me. And this is what the Buddha is suggesting and holding up for all Buddhist practitioners. We realize it's upon us all to experiment. It's upon us all to go to the place where experience is. I showed up at a monastery, and by normal worldly standards, a monastery is a disaster, right? Everybody looks the same. Everybody dresses the same, has the same haircut. You can't stand out. You can't accomplish anything. You're not going to make any money. You're not going to become popular. You're just like, and there's a whole bunch of you. If you looked at it from normal standards, there's no way you could excel. You're going to get lost in the crowd. But by Dhamma standards, the monastery was a brilliant idea, because you're doing something subversive. You're trying to reduce your responsibilities to the minimum so that you can have the most time for practice. It's a very subversive thing. You're kind of like sneaking out the back door while Mara is occupied. Yeah, all the forces of delusion, get distracted, and you're just working on yourself. You're training yourself day and night. And this is what's presented to us as a possibility, that this is what we're doing when we sit on the cushion, when we listen to a Dhamma talk, when we read a Dhamma book, when we try to practice with the precepts, is we are training ourselves. We're practicing being trained. Yeah. And if we have an inclination towards that, it starts to ripen, and it ripens into what we call saddha, or faith, which is that I can do this. I can learn. I can change. I can evolve. I can adapt. The craving can be abandoned. And this is it is a sort of it's a technique of working with delusion in a way, because there is a sort of Goldilocks zone where If we've got too much suffering, we're not going to let go of our craving. But if we don't have enough suffering, we don't think to let go of our craving. So we've got to get ourselves knowing that we're deluded and we have craving and we're prone to, making bad decisions. Can we get ourselves into a situation where, nevertheless, it's possible and we have the inspiration to let go of that craving, nonetheless? That we're willing to experiment and see what'll happen. If we do that enough, then the Buddha says we become independent of all others in the dispensation. That means we don't need peers, we don't need teachers, we don't need the Buddha. Because at that point, we carry the Buddha with us, we carry the Dhamma with us, the Sangha with us. At that point where we know how to train ourselves, we're independent of all other teachers and trainers. And that's not to say that we won't benefit from hearing another Dhamma talk or reading another Dhamma book or being around another practitioner, but we don't need them. From that point, the Buddha says, you're golden. You're going to make it because you will never be without a trainer. You'll never be without the resources you need to get to your destination. And this is what we're all working towards, whether we're doing it at a monastery, whether we're doing it in our home environment, whether we're doing it for an hour or two a week, or we're doing it for an hour or two a day, or we're doing it for multiple hours every day, every week. All of those scenarios are the same ultimately if we get this idea of training, if that seed is planted in us. So the last thing I would put to you, and because I heard this Dhamma talk and then something happened, I forgot about it. I didn't need it anymore. I didn't have to keep going back to the Dhamma talk. It's like the ideas were planted. And you maybe, if you haven't had that experience or you heard something and you're like, wait, this is something I can do. And you come up with a phrase, or you come up with an idea, and then you start doing it, you start applying it. Well, then ask yourself, are you eager for the training? Yeah, and if you get in that mind state of like the martial artist showing up at the dojo, wanting to learn, then you might find that in any Dhamma talk or in any Dhamma book, you could have these applicable principles will start to float to the surface. And you can get good at that, seeing how you work with the Dhamma, how you put it into practice. Well, then faith and confidence and self-sufficiency is really just around the corner. So this is a talk about a talk, but also a talk about my early years of monasticism, maybe a perspective most people haven't heard before, because that's basically, it's all it is. You go to a monastery and disappear into training, and you cease to be a person in the worldly sense. You're just, because you're so focused. Yeah. So that's an interesting idea. We're all doing that. But I offer this to you tonight on the Uposatha night, when many of you have taken on re-upped your precepts, or taken on optional precepts to practice with. And maybe there's been some ideas here that you can take with you and put into practice. And if so, may they bear fruit. Sadhu, sadhu,
Sadhu,
sadhu.
sadhu.